Go to the rail situation, I did want to say a few words and put this issue into a broader context, and then I'll get to the rail situation. As I think most Americans know, today we have more income and wealth inequality than any time in the history of our country. People on top are doing phenomenally well, while working people are struggling to keep their heads above water. During the pandemic, while essential workers like those employed at the railroads, while these people put their lives on the line and died by the thousands, the billionaire class, the people on top, saw a $2 trillion increase in their wealth. Workers died by the tens of thousands. People on top became much richer. Further, as healthcare costs soar, we have over 70 million Americans who are either uninsured or underinsured. And in addition, the United States remains the only major country on earth not to guarantee paid family and medical leave. That's the broad issue that we have got to look at as we look at the situation in the rail industry. Mr. President, as I understand it, it is not accurate to say that the President of the United States has agreed to what the PBE has come up with. They have come up with a proposal. But right now, as we speak, Labor Secretary Marty Walsh is currently meeting with the rail unions and management in trying to forge an agreement. And I happen to wish them well, and I hope that those meetings lead to an agreement that is fair and that is just. But let us make no mistake about what's happening in the rail industry right now, and I did not hear one word of that from my Republican colleagues. And that is that the rail industry has seen huge profits in recent years, and last year alone made a record-breaking $20 billion in profit. Last year, the rail industry made $20 billion in profit. And let me also mention that the CEOs of many of these rail companies are enjoying huge compensation packages. For example, last year, the CEO of CSX made over $20 million in total compensation, while the CEOs of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern made over $14 million each in total compensation. In other words, what's happening in the rail industry is what's happening all over this country. Corporate profits are soaring, and CEOs are making incredibly large compensation packages. I would also add that the parent company of BNSF, one of the largest freight rail companies in America, is Berkshire Hathaway, owned by Warren Buffett. Mr. Buffett is the fourth wealthiest man in America, worth nearly $100 billion. During the pandemic, as rail workers risked their lives to keep the economy going, Mr. Buffett became $33 billion richer. But, Mr. President, in the midst of all of those profit increases for the industry, in the midst of huge compensation packages for the CEOs of the industry, in the midst of increased wealth for those who own these companies, what's going on for the workers? I think that's a fair question to ask if we're in the midst of negotiations. What's going on for the workers? How are they doing? It turns out that the key issue in the current negotiations is not about salaries. Apparently, there is an agreement on that. The key issue that is being contested is about the working conditions in the industry, which are absolutely unacceptable and are almost beyond belief. Right now, if you work in the freight rail industry, one of the most grueling and dangerous jobs in America, you are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. In case you missed it, let me repeat it. You are entitled to 0 sick days. What that means is that if you as a worker get sick, if your child gets sick, if your spouse gets sick, and you need to take time off of work, not only will you not get paid, you actually could get fired. And that is precisely what is happening today in the rail industry. How crazy is that? Mr. President, let me remind you of what you undoubtedly know, that hundreds of Americans are still dying every day from COVID, and tens of thousands are being hospitalized as a result of this deadly virus. What the freight rail industry is saying to its workers is this: it doesn't matter if you have COVID. It doesn't matter if you are lying in a hospital bed because of a medical emergency. It doesn't matter if your wife just gave birth to your child. It doesn't matter. If you do not come into work, no matter what the reason, we in the industry, we the bosses, have the right to fire you. Really? Do these conditions really exist in the United States of America, the wealthiest country on earth, in the year 2022? Mr. President, I do wonder if the CEO of the railroad or other top executives at that railroad, I wonder if they would get fired if they got sick or if they had a medical emergency in their families. I doubt very much that they would get fired. Further, I should add that quite sensibly, the federal government guarantees 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to its workers. That's what we do as a federal government. So, if you are an employee at the Department of Transportation in the United States, sitting behind a desk, you are appropriately, I believe in this very much, guaranteed 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. That's if you work at the Department of Transportation. But if you are an engineer running a train with tons of freight behind you, a very dangerous job, you get 0 sick leave. Now, that may make sense to somebody, but it doesn't make sense to me. As a result of this reactionary policy of denying workers sick time, rail conductors, engineers, and other rail employees are coming into work sick and exhausted, which is a danger not only to themselves, but to their coworkers and everyone else who is around them. Mr. President, as part of the contract negotiations, the rail workers are asking for 15 paid sick days. This is not a radical idea. We are the only major country on earth that does not guarantee paid sick days. In Germany, workers are entitled to 84 weeks of paid sick leave at 70% of their salary. In Norway, workers are entitled to 1 year of paid sick leave at 100% of their salary. In the UK, workers are entitled to up to 28 weeks of paid sick leave. The rail workers in the United States are not asking for 1 year of paid sick leave. They're not asking for 6 months of paid sick leave. They are asking for 15 days. 15 days. Now, the rail industry has said, as I understand it, that they just cannot afford to do that, just don't have the money. And they say it would cost too much money to provide their workers with any paid sick days. Just can't afford to do it. Well, let's see. They made over $20 billion in profits last year. They provide their CEOs with huge compensation packages. And here's something else that everyone should know who's getting involved in this issue. Last year, the rail industry spent over $18 billion not to improve rail safety, not to address the supply chain crisis in America, but to buy back its own stock and hand out huge dividends to its wealthy stockholders. In fact, since 2010, the rail industry has spent over $183 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. So here is where we are, Madam President. It turns out that guaranteeing 15 paid sick days to rail workers would cost the industry a grand total of $688 million a year. That is less than 3.5% of their annual profits. Now, it seems to me that if 4 major rail carriers can afford to spend over $18 billion a year on stock buybacks and dividends, please don't tell me they cannot afford to guarantee 15 paid sick days to their workers and allow these workers to have a reasonable quality of life, which they don't enjoy today. If the Burr-Wicker resolution passed, rail workers would be entitled to 0 paid sick days and 0 unpaid sick days. That is clearly unacceptable. But, Madam President, the outrage over the lack of paid sick leave is not the only issue being negotiated. The rail workers of this country are sick and tired of unreliable scheduling, which is having an horrendous impact on their personal and family lives. In America today, rail workers are on call for up to 14 consecutive days, 12 hours a day. In fact, it is not uncommon for many rail workers to be on call virtually 24 hours a day, with a requirement to report to work within 90 minutes for shifts that can last nearly 80 hours. My office has heard from rail workers who received calls from management at 2 in the morning requiring them to show up for work at 4 a.m. Again, this is not only unacceptable, it is dangerous, and it has led to a substantial increase in the rate of injuries in the freight rail industry. Madam President, if the Burr-Wicker resolution were to pass, these unfair and unsafe working conditions would be allowed to continue, threatening the safety not only of the workers, but of passengers as well. Finally, Madam President, the Burr-Wicker resolution could allow the freight rail industry, to substantially increase the cost workers would have to pay for health care. So, let us be clear. We are talking about an industry that not only made $20 billion in profits last year and spent over $18 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. We're talking about an industry that has slashed its workforce by nearly 30% over the last 6 years, leaving its remaining workforce woefully understaffed and overworked. We're talking about an industry that has seen its profit margins nearly triple over the past 20 years. Madam President, today, what Congress should be doing is not passing the Burr-Wicker resolution and forcing railroad workers back to work under horrendous working conditions. What we should be doing is telling the CEOs in the rail industry, treat your workers with dignity and respect, not contempt. Do not fire workers for the crime of going to a doctor when they are sick. Make sure that your workers have 15 paid sick days and adequate time off to rest and spend with their families. At a time when you, the industry, are making record-breaking profits, do not increase the cost of health care for your employees. The CEOs in the freight rail industry need to understand that they cannot have it all. The rail industry must agree to a contract that is fair and that is just, and if they are not prepared to do that, it is time for Congress to stand on the side of workers for a change and not just the head of large multinational corporations. Rail workers have a right to strike for reliable schedules. They have a right to strike for paid sick days. They have a right to strike for safe working conditions. Rail workers have a right to strike for decent benefits. The Burr-Wicker resolution would take these fundamental rights away from workers. We cannot allow that to happen. Therefore, Madam President, I object.